The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. My name is Ralph Tycho, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I'm privileged to have a returning guest to the airwaves to talk about those days when we were a little kid at age 12. Our passion starts to meet our intellect as baseball fans. And Maxwell, tell us all about it. Maxwell Kates.
Well, first of all, Ralph, thank you very much for having me on your show. This is my second appearance on your show, having been here back in 2019, and in the words of one of our heroes, Vin Scully, good afternoon and a happy Sunday to wherever you may be today.
All right, that's a good Vin Scully.
Thank you.
I'm not a Dodger fan, but I miss him on the airwaves. He was truly, he and John Miller were truly the best announcers of their time. My time was when Mel Allen and Red Barber and Phil Rizzuto were announcing. Maxwell, who was your favorite of all time? I guess it was Vin.
My favorite of all time was Vin, and you know what? You were saying that you're not a Dodgers fan, but the truth be told, neither was Vin Scully. Vin grew up in the Bronx, and he actually grew up a New York Giants fan.
Absolutely. His favorite player of all time was Mel Ott. And when it came time to doing his last game on the air, I think if I'm not mistaken, he did it from the Giant Stadium, whatever it was called in those days, ATT or whatever. And he made a special point of that. And that's one of the reasons I respected him. He could maintain his objectivity as an announcer. And he called some beautiful moments. The Sandy Koufax perfect game against the Cubs. I remember Joey Amalfitano was involved in that. And he was a dandy. What was your favorite Vin Scully memory?
My favorite Vin Scully memory was actually the first World Series game I can remember watching. I may have watched World Series games beforehand, but my first year as an avid baseball fan was when I was 10 years old, which was 1988. And the first World Series game, Oakland Athletics against the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Dodgers had just beaten the heavily favored New York Mets, your other favorite team. And game one, it looked like the A's were going to pull it off with Eckersley in the pen. And off the bench comes, hobbling on one leg, Kirk Gibson. And we all know how that ends. He hits one out of the park, and I do not believe what I just saw. The improbable has happened.
I watched that game in a hotel room in Santa Cruz with an avid A's fan. And I was kind of neutral in those days. I was a San Francisco Giant fan when I came out to join them after they left New York when I was 12. So it's an incredible turnaround how what comes around turns around in baseball. But that was a great call. And yes, indeed, those were good days. Tell me about specifically that year when you were 10. I'm going to modify it for you because you became an avid fan 2 years earlier than most kids. Most kids at 12, that's their magic number. But who took you to your first game?
My first game was it was my uncle's tickets. It was my mother and father took my brother and I. I remember it perfectly. It was a very hot day. It was something like 95 degrees Fahrenheit. With the Canadian dollar exchange rate, it was more like 35 degrees Celsius. We were watching the Toronto Blue Jays play the Minnesota Twins. The Twins had just come off winning the World Series the year before. Juan Berenguer was a starting pitcher for Minnesota. Jeff Musselman, who was a Harvard graduate playing in the major leagues, was the starting pitcher for the Blue Jays. And it was trouble from the Blue Jays almost right from the beginning. The second batter of the game, an infielder from Malden, Massachusetts by the name of Steve Lombardozzi. He was at bat, and Ernie Witt had a pass ball, and it went downhill right from there. Kirby Puckett did what Kirby Puckett is known to do. He hit a double with the bases loaded, and that put the Twins ahead. I think it was 5-1 at that point. Fred McGriff did hit a home run later in the game, but Minnesota went on to win 8-3. That was my first game.
And do you have any memorabilia, the scorecard, or anything that you saved, the ticket stub that you could keep with you for a lifetime? I'm just curious about that.
Bought a copy of the program and the yearbook, and I remember my dad teaching me how to keep score. If I have that, it's somewhere in my parents' basement. The yearbook I saved, that had George Bell on the cover, and I remember, unfortunately, being 10 years old, trying to trace the players' faces and so forth, so it's probably worth nothing. And then I did manage to replace it with a mint condition copy when I was in my 30s, but that's more for presentation purposes. The memories are more associated with the one that I wrecked up.
Absolutely. I know that feeling very well, where no matter what the price, it's the memories. And
exactly.
That's one of the reasons you qualify for this show. You are a Walter Mitty type fan, a fanatical fan. And I just want to know if you ever had any reservations about rooting for Toronto, your favorite team.
Well, actually, Toronto wasn't my favorite team. I grew up in Ottawa, and we were closer to Montreal than Toronto, and so I probably had more access to Expos games than Blue Jays games at that time. It was much easier to get tickets for the Expos and the Blue Jays, particularly after the move to Skydome in 1989. Where I really became a baseball fan, though, was on trips to visit my aunt and uncle in their winter home in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We had the Yankees just up the road doing spring training games. We had the Expos and the Atlanta Braves. You take the 95 of the Turnpike north to West Palm Beach, and they were there. So those were probably the teams I followed most often, the Expos, the Braves, and the Yankees, more than the Blue Jays. But the Blue Jays certainly had an exciting team in those years. From 1983 to 1993, they were easily the most consistent team in the American League. They won 5 division titles, 2 world championships, and they built the team the right way. I mean, they didn't just buy a championship. The core of that team was built through their farm system. If they needed somebody to put them over the top, they'd get them in a trade. Pat Gillick was a master at the Rule 5 draft. They picked up players like George Bell and Willie Upshaw that way. They got Tom Henke out of the short-lived compensation pool when they lost Cliff Johnson as a free agent to the Texas Rangers. And then that only got them so far. And then they went out and they picked up Dave Winfield as a free agent in 1992. And he had what it took to put the team over the top. And that was not only the first world championship for the Blue Jays, it was the only world championship of Dave Winfield's career.
Was that the Gary Carter home run?
The Joe Carter home run. That was
Joe Carter. I'm sorry.
That was the following year. That was 1993. You know, that was the Joe Carter home run. That was,
Joe Carter.
In fact,
yes.
I met Joe Carter at a Blue Jays game about 10 years after the fact, and I quoted an interview he did with Sheldon Auker of the Akron Beacon Journal back when he played for Cleveland. He was asked what his ultimate sports fantasy was, and Joe Carter said to win Game 7 of the World Series with a home run. This was 1980. And I reminded Joe Carter of this, and he said, well, I did even better than that. I won the World Series with a home run in Game 6.
Beautiful,
Something
beautiful
neither
comeback.
else could claim.
And he wasn't modest about it. He remembered the quote and was proud of the quote. You had the advantage of a team to root for in the American League and in the National League. What was it like for you when the Expos moved back to or moved to Washington?
Well, by that point, I had already moved to Toronto, and I sort of saw the writing on the wall for several years, but at the same time, it was sad to see that I grew up with Expos baseball. From the time I was 15, I started watching Ottawa Lynx baseball. That was the Expos AAA team, and kids who grew up in the mid-2000s and after who loved baseball wouldn't have that anymore. I mean, the Lynx hung on until 2007. I think they were the Philadelphia Phillies farm team at the end before they moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania. So if you lived in that part of the world and you really wanted to get involved with following a baseball team, you had to go to Toronto, which was a little bit farther away, and that was pretty well the only option. Toronto is a 5-hour drive, probably 6 hours the way I drive from Ottawa, and Montreal is a 2-hour drive from Ottawa. So it was much easier to get to Expos games than to Blue Jays games.
Did hockey ever give baseball some competition for your fandom, for your or was it all baseball?
Not so much when I was younger. I mean, I was better at playing baseball than I was at hockey. As I got older, and I got involved with radio. I worked in radio in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the late 1990s, and we covered all sports. And by osmosis, I became more interested in hockey at that point, because you needed to follow everything in order to be able to report it on the air. And so,
okay. Let me ask you this: where does hockey stand in terms of running a league compared to Major League Baseball?
Well, I think Major League Baseball is under more scrutiny than the other sports. I think when baseball screws up, which seems to be quite often, people know about it very quickly. And when the other sports do, it's bad, but it doesn't get scrutinized as carefully. I'll give you a good example. The 2004-2005 NHL season was wiped out due to a lockout. By 2005-2006, people didn't even think about it anymore. I mean, the league was back. Hockey was still as popular as ever. People were going to games. They were following it on television. And nobody talked about that lockout anymore. People are still talking about 1994 as though it happened yesterday in baseball.
Yes, absolutely. And mentioning Matt Williams, who should have won a home run title, or he could have broken the home run record in that year. And as a purist in baseball, I'm still offended. I understand what you mean. Why is it so much different for a hockey fan to accept what happened than it is for a baseball fan like myself? I'm still fighting the DH, as an example. Why do you suppose that is? Well,
up until 1967, there were only 6 teams in the National Hockey League, and
right.
So it was pretty well a regional game at that point. Then in '67, it expanded from 6 teams to 12, and by the mid-'70s, if you include the World Hockey Association, there were more than 30 teams. So it was at that era that people were really following the game outside the Northeast on a major league level, and they were following the game of the 60s and 70s. Whereas in baseball had 16 teams in, again, northeastern United States, going as far as St. Louis, going back to 1901, and that's pretty well the way it stayed until the 50s, and that's when innovation began to change. And so you had more teams, and more fans and more teams who were used to the way things had been done in the past in baseball than you might have had in hockey and certainly in basketball as well. The NBA only began in 1946.
Yes, and pro football, too, was born in the late 40s at a time when baseball was the only thing people really cared about, at least in New York. Maxwell, what do you like about today's game as opposed to yesterday's game? And we're talking baseball. And what do you dislike about it?
Well, I think the more they tinker with the game unnecessarily, the more they take away from the product. For example, the control of the time. I think they've been penny wise and pound foolish. I mean, sure, they're wise to monitor the number of seconds between pitches and the number of mound visits and so forth. But then you can have a challenge which takes 10 minutes out of the game. I mean, that to me takes away from the enjoyment of it. I think if I were 10 or 12 years old, I'd feel differently about this. I don't know the last time you went to a game, Ralph, but they amplify the sound system between innings in order to play the music louder and so forth than they do during the actual game. And
well, I think that came from the example that football and basketball set. Their arenas and their venues are 12 times as loud as baseball. And maybe that's what young people want.
Maybe it is.
Yeah.
I mean, in some respect, having more teams in the playoffs entices more fans to follow the game. It makes the races more interesting, but you run the risk of having a less interesting final product in the World Series. I mean, the last time you had a full season, I'm not counting 2020 where you only had 60 games, but the last time you had a full 162-game season where the two best teams made the World Series was 2013, Boston and St. Louis.
Wow.
And you have teams that aren't necessarily, maybe there are a couple games over 500. The 2006 St. Louis Cardinals are a good example of that. You're playing deep into October, November. If you're playing in Northern City, the weather's is bound to be terrible. I can remember watching the World Series between the Giants and the Detroit Tigers in 2012 where people looked like they were dressed for winter. In fact, 2008, Philadelphia, you remember, it was snowing in the middle of the game and they wouldn't call it until the tie was broken.
Right. I do remember that. Boy, does time ever fly. That was 2008. Incredible. What would you change about today's game, if you could, if you had one sweeping change in mind?
Make the games start earlier. Have the games more. Have the play of the games more efficient. Make the tickets less expensive. I just don't know how you're going to do that as long as players like Juan Soto reject $400 million contract extensions.
Well, yes. That puts the Mets and the Yankees in a quandary. Does a team give up 4 or 5 of their best prospects for a proven superstar? And that's been an issue in sports for a long time. The best trades that were ever made were the trades that were never made, it's been said. So what were you going to say? I interrupted you.
Well, what I was going to say is it's always dangerous to put all your eggs in one basket, particularly when you're talking about that kind of money. I mean, look at the contract that San Diego gave Fernando Tatis, and he's been injured almost ever since he signed it. Or then you could have somebody like Francisco Lindor on the Mets who signed an equally outrageous contract and hasn't lived up to it. It's,
he hasn't in the past, but who's the number 2 RBI guy in the National League, or number 3 guy? He is, despite a 245 average, just superb in the field and very, very clutch. And you're talking to a guy who came down on him very, very hard for last year's performance. But he's making up for it seems. And but what, a 10-year contract for $30 million a year? Is that unbelievable? Is that an unbelievable risk? Let's put it that way.
Well, the danger there, Ralph, is that he's off to a good start this year, halfway through the year, but suppose he has another bad year next year and he's making $30 million, and some second baseman who's about to file for free agent saying, look, Lindor is making $30 million, batting .218. I'm batting .268 or .288. I want $40 million a year, or I'm not signing.
Well, again, there's more to it than just the average. There's the production and OPS and defense, but that's a labor thing. The baseball let that get unraveled, let's say, when they let the unions become out of hand at that point. And who could blame them? As a player, as a working person, you want all you can. And it's always been labor management disputes in any industry that take up a lot of time and a lot of thoughts in people's minds. And who could blame them? You're putting money on the person's table or taking it off the table. And can't blame them for getting all they can. By the same token, the game is being controlled by TV money that finances all of the extravagant pay. And they really control when the game starts, when it finishes. They control the fact that a kid growing up like we did can't see the World Series because it's played at night, can't see an all-star game. I think if there's one thing wrong with baseball, capital B, the industry of baseball, not the game of baseball, is that they are not catering to the future patron, the child. They're not letting the child build up memories like you had when you went to your first game. And I think eventually it's going to cost them. What say you?
Well, I think there's been so many memories that you and I would have had, not just of attending games, but watching games on television or going to events with players. I mean, somebody like Tom Boswell will tell you that one of the defining moments of his life was, as a kid, his mother took him and his brother to a department store to meet Roy Sievers. He lived in the Washington, D.C. area. Anyways, Boswell gets lost in the department store, and he gets all upset because he's going to miss seeing Roy Sievers. Anyways, Sievers goes and finds him and brings him back to the mother, and he signs an autograph for him. And that was a childhood memory that he takes to this day. In the same way, the first baseball player I ever met was Jesse Barfield. He was appearing at a stereo store in Mississauga, Ontario. That's one suburb west of Toronto. We were visiting my grandparents, and we read in the paper that Barfield was going to be appearing at this store that day. And Barfield had his lucky red shirt, and so my brother wore a red shirt, and I wore a red shirt. And we drove down, and there was this big lineup outside the store. And at one point they said, okay, Barfield's got to leave. He's got to play. And they were going to have a riot on their hands. There was this kid standing behind me wearing all this Blue Jay stuff. He starts crying, and then finally Barfield says, no, I'm going to stay until everybody gets their stuff signed. And we met him, and we had our picture taken with him. And 20 years later, I'm at a golf tournament, and I brought with copies of the pictures. I said, do you remember this? He said, yes. I said, would you mind signing these for my brother and I? He said, absolutely. And Marla Barfield is on Facebook, and that's Jesse Barfield's wife. And when I saw that, I showed her the picture. I said, does this look familiar to you? And she said, Jesse loved doing stuff like this. I mean, Jesse and Houston now, they've got grandchildren, and they both have an active presence on social media, and it's great to see that for all his success with the Blue Jays and the Yankees, he's still great at associating with the fans. And those are the sorts of memories that are so important. I mean, nowadays, even if a player wanted to make that sort of an appearance, if his agent found out about it, the agent would say, you're not doing it unless I get a cut of the action. One year, I remember, I'm not going to say the year or the city that it took place, but one year, the Sabre Convention was going to a major league city, and a Hall of Famer associated with that team had said that he was going to speak at the convention. Well, that's exactly what happened. The agent found out about it, and all of a sudden they didn't have a deal with this Hall of Famer anymore. And so that's too bad. But that's the reality of they used to have these old-timers dinners in Toronto where you'd get 5 or 6 players to come and tell stories about their career and sign autographs and so forth. And the players who were willing to do this were either getting into their 70s or 80s, or they were dying off. And one time they approached
Maxwell, do you remember the Cracker Jack All-Star games that they had? Did you attend any of those?
No, I never did, but I certainly know about the home run Luke Appling hit.
Yes, 76 years old, hits a home run, and I think of him, not because of the home run, I think of him a lot. If he were playing in today's game, he would have broken, he like Gwynn and a few others, Boggs, they would have broken the shift. There's no question about it. Appling had bat control, and you don't hear of situational hitters anymore. And that's how the game has changed for me. Get him on, get him over, get him in. You don't hear that. There's no strategy. There's no bunting. There's no hit and run. There's no hitting behind a player. And I think that's changed for the negative. For the positive, the athleticism of these guys is incredible at this point. Can you give me an example of something that comes to your mind to illustrate the great athleticism in today's game? Maxwell?
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
Okay.
In terms of the athleticism of today's game, I mean, the players are definitely larger and stronger and better conditioned than they were even 20 or 30 years ago. In terms of the conditioning, the athleticism, I guess the first example I could think of is we had a wonderful defensive center fielder in Toronto a few years ago, a fellow by the name of Kevin Pillar, and he would make these wondrous catches on the turf at the Rogers Center or against the wall. And to see these catches was you had to believe it. You had to see it to believe it.
Okay.
And that he was making these on AstroTurf.
Right. Jim Edmonds light catches. I'll bet you're thinking of him.
I was thinking of Jim Edmonds, but then I realized that we're talking about 20 years ago already. I was at a game in Cincinnati. It was during the Sabre Convention where we were sitting in the sun deck in right field, and Jason LaRue of Cincinnati he hits a long fly ball to right field. It looks like it's going to come into our section. Next thing I know, Edmonds reaches over the fence and grabs it. It was one of the most outstanding plays I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, they called him early in his career. Edmonds was from Diamond Bar, California. They called him Diamond Jim, kind of like Diamond Jim Gentile of a different generation. I always think of him that way when I see those catches. He made catches like that when he played for Anaheim earlier in his career as well. No, he was a fantastic defensive outfielder.
You mentioned Jim Gentile. He's living in Oklahoma. He's like 89 years old. He's inordinately articulate, and he has a full bag of marbles. I've been trying to get him on my podcast for a while, and I hope to succeed. There you go. Every name has a connotation. What books did you read as a kid? What baseball books?
Oh, a lot of them. I read all the Smith, Streets, and Smith. I read all the Bill Mazeroski's baseball. One time I was home from school sick, and my dad gave me Ball 4 to read. My mom told my dad, don't let him read that, and it was already too late. And so that I got a real education reading that. I read biographies like The Mick. I read The Boys of Summer. I read, you name it. I still read lots.
I got to tell you my favorite story from Ball 4, which was basically written by Schuster. He was the editor of it, and he supplied a lot of the humor. The guys are getting off the plane and they're meeting their wives, and one guy says, "Look horny, here come the wives." So that's Ball 4. Leonard Schechter, as a matter of fact. I blanked on his first name. But he wrote another book after Ball 4 came out called The Jocks. And if you bibliography to the show, if you get a chance to order it on eBay, I'm sure it's out of print. And he also wrote a book about the latter days of the Mets, latter days being 62 to 69. And that was a good one. So I remember Leonard Schechter as well as I remember some of these ball players. But that was indeed a great book. Let me get to know you another way. What kind of music did you listen to in those days?
Probably more consistent with my parents' generation than my own. I mean, I listened to a lot of the Beatles. I listened to a lot of the Motown music. I don't know. That was just sort of the music I grew up with. My brother was more attuned with what was current, but I preferred the music from an earlier generation.
Beautiful.
I'm not sure if there's any great way.
When you say an earlier generation, and you mentioned the Beatles, it makes me feel like an old geese, but that's all right. I felt like that before. I can live with it, and I'd rather be an old geese than a dead geese. So, but the Beatles, I remember, as a kid when they first came into being, Meet the Beatles. That was their first album. Maxwell, is there anything you'd like to leave the baseball community with before we close it out?
Well, you asked me to prepare a few stories for you. We still have a little bit of time, and just thought
Please, yes. Tell some stories. In my religion, there's an expression in Yiddish, "Sag mir a Geschichte." That means, tell me a story.
And in my religion, we have an expression, we need 8 more men because Mincha's in 15 minutes.
I think those religions are pretty similar. We could find the minyan on Comfortably Zoned. There's a lot of Yids contribute, including Al Bach and Al Blumkin and Wayne Unger and the Rhodes Brothers and So we have a Yiddish flavor, a New York flavor, and I didn't realize that you were a Yiddish bacha.
Well, as a matter of fact, the last time I was in New York was in 2017, and I was there for the Sabre convention. We were staying at the Hyatt at the Grand Central Terminal, and I realized that was around the corner from a property management firm that was called Maxwell Kates.
Really?
So the thing I did after I dropped off my luggage, I went over there. I said to the security guard, "You got to let me in. I've got the same name as this company." So he sent me up. I had my picture taken with the sign, and how they got the name was the founders of it was a property management firm. The founder's name was Bob Friedman, and he named it after his two children. His son's name was Maxwell, and his daughter's name was Catherine, but she always went by a nickname, which was Kates. So you put the two of them together, and I'm sort of real estate's answer to Mr. Sparkle on The Simpsons.
Oh, wow. Wow. You mentioned Kate. The late Kate Feeney was one of my favorite human beings. Chub Feeney's daughter. Yeah, worked for the Giants for a long time and died much too early, as a lot of us do. And I think of her all the time, speaking of Kates. But that is interesting.
She would have been Horace Stoneham's granddaughter, I guess.
Yes. I don't know if Chub Feeney was adopted, or maybe I'm thinking of the Minnesota lineage of the Washington lineage, had some adopted kids. The Griffins did. But yes, Chub Horace Stoneham's granddaughter. And speaking of books, Bill Veck's book as a kid was very, very educational material. A lot of educational material to a young fan, and he talked about Horace Stoneham a lot. There's a fellow who just wrote a book about Horace Stoneham, who I've had on the air, Steve Trader. So he wrote a terrific book about Horace, and there were some great Yankee Giant teams, and Chubb basically was the general manager of those teams. And I mean, what do you say? Willie McCovey, Cepeda, Mays, Jim Ray Hart, Gaylord Perry, Juan Marichal, Tim Haller, Tommy Haller, great teams. And privileged to live in Northern California as I do. Not only do we have the weather, but we have two teams, one American, one national, one likely not to be here after a bit, the A's. We could talk about them for a long time. Maxwell, your favorite baseball moment, if you would.
My favorite baseball moment took place in 2006 after the Expos had left Montreal and after I had adopted the Detroit Tigers as my new team, bearing in mind that between 1989 and 2005, the Tigers had the worst composite record in baseball, even worse than the four expansion teams. And then in 2006, they got off to a fantastic start. They were leading the division for most of the season. They ended up losing the division the last weekend of the season to the Minnesota Twins, but still managed to make it to the championship series where they faced the Oakland Athletics. They won the first three games. They were trailing the fourth game. And then I believe there were two runners on, two outs. Miguel Cabrera comes up to bat. facing Houston Street. He cranks one into the park for a home run. Tigers are going to the World Series. That for me was my greatest moment. Was watching that. It was okay. It's time to do over with a new team, and this is going to be my new team. And they were exciting to watch for about 10 years or so. Then they went back to being terrible starting around 2017. But that's baseball. I mean, everybody has a chance at 12 o'clock. Everybody has a chance at 6 o'clock. It's what you do when you get to 12 o'clock that matters.
Right. Maxwell, if it weren't for sports, baseball in particular, what would be your passion?
Probably comedy. I mean, I was a huge comedy fan growing up. I can remember visiting my grandparents and reading books like The Joys of Yiddish and The Big Book of Jewish Humor. One of my favorite shows growing up was a show that wasn't well known in the United States. It was a Canadian show called Wayne and Schuster, and they did a lot of parodies. They did a lot. They would take Shakespeare and they would do parodies of it, or they would take popular TV series and they would do parodies of it. And then at one point, it was sort of here today, gone tomorrow. They were off the air, and nobody could really explain why. And then about 15 years later, I went to England, and I discovered a show there called Morecambe and Wise. And they had long since passed away, as had Wayne and Schuster by this point. But I discovered it was the exact same humor. And yet, their humor sustained over in England. I remember going to a juggling. There was these two jugglers on unicycle at Trafalgar Square in London. And as they were juggling, they were telling Morecambe and Wise jokes, and the audience knew all the material. And so it just speaks to the universality of humor, that you can find two people from two very distinct cultures and two very distinct countries telling very similar material.
Very interesting. I did some comedy myself in the 80s and 90s, and I happen to remember Wayne and Schuster. I think they were on Sullivan quite a bit, if I'm not mistaken. They were. Yes. Wonderful. Hey, thank you. And it's been 2 years since you've been here. Give us a story to take us out, and promise it won't be another 2 years before you come back.
Well, as soon as you'll have me back, I'll try to make it back. I mean, my line of work as an accountant, March and April is difficult, but other times of the year I should be available. I'll leave you off with the story you asked me to prepare, and that was about the time I met Rico Petrocelli. That when I was 12 years old, we took a family holiday to Vermont. I remember we were in a cabin at a resort where they had a swimming pool and a big water slide. One day we took the gondola off the mountain and went hiking up there. One day we went shopping in Stowe. One day we went to Ben & Jerry's. And one day we went to this baseball card show. And we get there and we see this sign, special guest, Boston Red Sox legend Rico Petrocelli. So we went into this room. We were expecting there to be a massive lineup. Rico, unfortunately, didn't draw flies. Unfortunately for the others, but fortunately for us, because it gave us the opportunity to spend a fair amount of time speaking to Rico Petrocelli. I think we must have spent 20 minutes talking to him, to the point that when it was ready for him to leave the show, he came looking for us to say goodbye and how much he enjoyed meeting us.
Wow.
About 25 years later, there was an advertisement for a book. It was called An All-Stars Cardboard Memories, that a couple from Boston, Tom and Ellen Zappala, had written with Rico Petrocelli. And what it was Rico's recollections of the players that he saw play growing up in New York and the players that he played with and against in the major leagues. And I wrote Tom and Ellen a note saying, I met Rico at a card show in Vermont. I wonder if he remembers it. I deliberately didn't say where in Vermont it was. Anyways, the book arrives at my office a few weeks later, and it's inscribed, To Maxwell, you were 8 years old when I met you at the South Burlington, Vermont card show. How time flies. Great memories. With best wishes, Rico Petrocelli. You see, to me, the almost as valuable as a signature.
Much more valuable. Just the memory at 8 years old is what's valuable.
Sure. That he would remember it. I mean, Rico Petrocelli.
That story illustrates your passion, and I hear it in your voice, and I love it. Where did you get those pipes, by the way, those radio pipes? Who helped you develop those? That
is one of the great mysteries in life. How I got this, how I ended up with this voice. I mean, one of the interesting things through traveling is that very rarely do people guess where I'm actually from. I was in Times Square at the tickets line. I was talking to somebody, and they said, "You're from Canada, aren't you?" I'm going, that doesn't happen very often. Speaking English, a lot of people think I'm from New York, and occasionally I get people who think I'm from England. Speaking French, more often than not, people think I'm from Germany when I speak French. So it's rare that people guess correctly, but where I got my voice from, that's a mystery. I don't even know. It's an enigma.
No specific training for radio. You just came in talking.
It just I remember when I was in high school, I used to do public address announcements, and the principal said to me before the first time I went on, "Just remember, enunciate. Do you know what that means?" And I answered back, imitating him, "It means saying every syllable of every word."
Clearly. That's wonderful. Thank you again, Maxwell. Terrific interview. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I am Ralph Tycho, certainly the weak link of the day. Maxwell Kates. Adios, everybody. Thank you for listening. Happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.